Episode 694. Book Talk begins at 12 minutes. Cranford begins with episode 679. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 694. Peace to you too. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by our lovely patrons, our YouTube channel members, and our craftlit.com/premium members. And this week, we would like to highlight Lena, Lisa Fagg, Tashi Hodliff, Jennifer Gordon, and Carmen Lau. Thank you so much for your support. We could not do this without you. Well, hello. How are you? I'm a little tired, actually. Aiden has a friend here, and they drove all the way down from New York. The mom and dad drove, and they're British. So Aiden said, well, could you, make a tea so that they can have something in their stomachs before they drive back home? So I did. There will be a picture on the screen and in the show notes. I made lemon apricot scones and cinnamon chip scones and clotted cream for realsies. And I bought lemon curd. I didn't make my own. I did find Branston pickle. I made my own peach chutney, and then we had cheeses out. But then the end, I brought out my summer pudding, the one where you line a pudding basin with bread and then stuff it full of all of the berries you can find and put bread on the top and then stick it in the refrigerator for at least 24 hours with a plate pushing down the top so that it squishes everything together. I was so scared last night that when I went to turn this thing over, because you have to flip it onto your plate, I was so afraid that it wasn't going to work. But I had seen one chef who took a thin, very flexible flat spatula and just gently worked it down the edges to make sure. But then he did something else when he inverted it and flipped it. Before he took the pudding basin off, he shook it until he could hear it kind of disengage. So use gravity while you've still got a form on it. I did the same thing, and it was perfect. And I don't know if I got a picture of that. I hope I did, because it really looked pretty. So we had a great time. They are lovely. That was a lot. So I spent most of the morning in bed. I am wearing one of my favorite shirts that Andrew's given me, though. The book was better. And every time I wear this shirt out in public, people stop me and say, where did you get that? I love that. And I keep thinking, oh, we have so many more book lovers in the world than we think. Made me happy. So, Raffle, once again, this month we have the Botanical Knits. So this is July 2025. We have Botanical Knits, 12 designs inspired by trees and foliage by Anna Davos of Never Not Knitting. And yeah, that we'll have the raffle set up so that you can go and put your name in the hat. We'll have that link in the show notes. I think I forgot to put it in the show notes this last week. And we have a link out to the book on bookshop.org to my Farley's bookstore if you wanted to go look at it online and see the more details about it. Today is the last day of Cranford officially, but not the last day of Cranford fun. So this is my last day of sharing my tea. Today I did Soul Warmer Herbal, which I love. This is the Rubus, which is, a light tea. This is a caffeine-free tea. I had all my caffeine for the week yesterday. They told me I made good tea, though. And I said, it's Andy Hayes' fault because he taught me how to. And I don't know if you saw it or listened to it yet, but we did post the video and the audio version of discussion, question and answer session with Andy Hayes from Plum Deluxe Tea. I learned so much. I hope you did too. This one also has apple pieces, cocoa nibs. I think that's part of the fun. Orange peel, calendula, which is good for you. Blue cornflowers, which you can see in the bag and they're pretty. Hazelnut and chestnut essences. I don't know if that means that they like wave a hazelnut over over the tea. What's the essence? Caramel extract. And we didn't talk about this, but this is nice. It actually has the allergen warning on it saying contains hazelnut and chestnut just in case. So he's a good man, that Andy Hayes. All right. I have two things for you. One is a video that I saw on sizing knitted sweaters that as soon as I was like halfway through the video, I sent it to myself and said, this has to go in the show notes because this is really useful. And then this morning, just on a fluke, Nimble Needles on YouTube. And this is his Q&A video called Unpopular Knitting Opinions, True or False? And most of his answers to questions that were posed, it's kind of like, am I the jerk questions? Most of the questions that were posed were things that we've all heard before or have left our mouths before because we were new at one point. Things like if you're knitting continental, you're doing it the wrong way. If you're doing a Norwegian purl, you're doing it the wrong way. We've all heard somebody say those things or actually thought them ourselves. He has a really wide variety of questions. Some of them I was really surprised by. And a couple of his answers also really surprised me. Not in a bad way, in a good way. I was like, I hadn't thought about it that way before, which was kind of nice. But if you haven't watched him before, he's very good. He's very good at teaching, and he's very good with his up-close demonstrations, which makes things much easier to learn. So yeah, two good things for you in the knitting arena. I'm still reading my Jane Austen graphic novel. I've been falling asleep so fast when I go to bed at night. I'm getting like a page and a half of a graphic novel done before I pass out. That and my Dear Reader game that I told you about, which I am still devotedly doing. And I'm so impressed at the way they consolidate these books using the original text. It's a work of art. They've really, really done such a lovely job with that game. It makes me very happy. And I'm getting to read books I've never heard of. I mean, I'm reading books that I've never heard of. But the nice thing is they don't just give you the expurgated version that you use to play the word games. You can play or you can read. And they're using, I think, the Gutenberg texts. So if you wanted to read the entire actual book after you played a game with it, that's there waiting for you. It's one-stop shopping, which I thought was really, really smart. But Cranford, okay, this is the last official chapter of Cranford. But today is going to be a two-parter. We're going to listen to chapter 16. But then while it's all fresh in your mind, we're going to play you out. It'll be just the last thing you listen to. You won't hear from me again until next week at that point. But there's an essay that I believe also appeared in Household Words that started this whole thing. And it's called The Last Generation in England. When you listen to it, you should have the smile on your face at all of the familiar stories that she tells in this. But in this essay, she is telling about the real life, non-fictionalized version of the story. So some of them are just a little bit different. And it's kind of cool to get to see how she did that motion from real life into fictionalized story. It's just kind of fun. And I thought I would go ahead and end with that now that you've gotten all of the fictionalized parts in your head. I did watch for the first time part 2 of Cranford. If you haven't seen Return to Cranford, it's okay. Signor Brunoni shows up. Actually, Signor Brunoni is a high point, but you have to wait until the very, very end. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. But boy, can you tell that it's not as much Gaskell as it is modern made connective tissue. They actually have Miss Betty doing things that she would never do, ever. And that freaked me out a little bit, but but it's still sweet, and you get to see all the pretty people in the pretty clothes. Michelle Dockerty from Downton Abbey and The Hogfather is in it. A very young Tom Hiddleston, who, oh my gosh, I forgot to tell you, I just saw him in The Life of Chuck. If this movie is out in your neighborhood and you're feeling a little down and you just need a pick me up, my friend claimed, and I agree with her, it is the best movie spontaneous, I'm using air quotes, spontaneous dance scene since La La Land. Well, there were a couple of spontaneous dance scenes in the Heights too, which were fantastic. But those were much bigger production numbers. This is just two people. If you at some point don't want to jump up on your feet and hope to God that you can learn really fast how to dance like the woman in that dance, if you if you want to dance like a woman, I don't know what's wrong with you. My toes were tapping. I had so much fun. And it's not that it's so much a happy movie. It has happy moments all the way through it, but it's a grown-up happy. Like Superman was like rousing. We saw that the weekend before. It was rousing. You felt great about things. It's like, yes, Superman is a good guy trying to be a good guy in a really complicated world. And the guy who plays Lex Luthor has one of the best evil genius monologues at the end that I think I've ever heard, because he sounds like a real person instead of like twisting the mustaches. So Superman, big rousing fun. Life of Chuck, life affirming fun. A little quieter, but with a great dance number in the middle. So, so yeah, that was my Tom Hiddleston tangent there. But Return to Cranford's fine. It's not, I don't think it's as good as the first one. Plus, you don't have Miss Jenkins, Deborah, in there. And she was so good in the first episodes. So there it is. But last week we did chapter 15. Peter came back. Yay. Peter came back with gifts for everyone and money, which is great. So Miss Maddie doesn't have to worry and she's not going to have to keep doing the tea shop. But this does mean there is a man in town. And he's not a man who has to like go to Drumble for work and just disappears from Monday through Friday. Peter's like Captain Brown. He's just going to be there, which means he's going to be gumming up the works in some respect. And he does in kind of interesting ways in today's chapter, chapter 16. Do not forget that, prepare yourself. Mary Smith's narrative spans many years and it crisscrosses all over itself because, you know, they're the end of one chapter early on that talked about Flora, little Flora, who is Jessie Brown's, now Jessie Brown Gordon, her daughter, Flora, was old enough to be able to read, but not particularly well, to Miss Jenkins as Miss Jenkins was basically dying. Now there's going to be a comment that she's almost grown up. I don't know what that means at this time in history. I figure like 13, 14, probably. So we've been flip-flopping across time quite a bit. So it's been at least 12 or 13, maybe 14 years since Miss Jessie married Major Gordon and they left. And we get to see them back because of course everybody's going to come back. This is the end of the book. This is the last chapter. Everybody's going to have to show up for the curtain call, right? We know that's happening. As a consequence, there are some names that we have heard, sometimes just in passing, sometimes just a long time ago. It's been a while since we saw Mr. Mulliner. Mr. Mulliner is Mrs. Jameson's very unpleasant butler or manservant. He's going to get mentioned. I think Miss Pole is going to make a comment about somebody reminding her of the father of the faithful. This is Father Abraham. And I'm going to put a pin in that for kind of Middle Eastern stuff. I'm going to get back to that. There's a reference to a tailor, a lame tailor named Simon Jones. I searched the text. I couldn't find anything about us talking about a lame tailor before. But, well, at least I couldn't find anything by that name. There is a Thomas Jones who escorted the ladies outside during their crime wave in Cranford. But yeah, he was the only Jones I could find. Maybe, you know what? I didn't search for just Taylor. Maybe I should have done that. If I find something, it'll go in the show notes. Arleys. The Arleys are the Arleys of Arley Hall. So there's the Arleys of Arley Hall, and then there's the meeting rooms that they have that are above the store. And very much like in Emma, especially if you do watch Cranford Part 2, you will see very much like Emma, the town has lost a lot of its more wealthy people and their influence. And so there are parts of Cranford that go largely unused now that used to be a big party site. You can kind of tell in the text that when these women were young, there was more of an active social world that they were involved in that kind of isn't there, just the same as in Emma. You're going to hear Peter talking about something that happened when he was a kid and seeing the Arley's coach go by. So they were in town and actively part of town back then. You will notice that we haven't been hanging out with or even really talking about even like accidentally rubbing elbows with the Arleys throughout this part of Cranford. Flora is the Gordon's daughter, Miss Jessie's daughter, and we don't know how old she is. She's almost grown up, quote unquote. There's also a mention of a Mr. Ludovic. Again, I went on Gutenberg and I did a search for his name and I came up Snake Eyes. I have no idea what that is. So this has happened in many chapters where Elizabeth Gaskell has had somebody, usually Miss Pole, say something about somebody being Oriental or something being Eastern. And I have mentioned many times before on the podcast about Edward Said and his book Orientalism. I thought, I need to give you guys a little bit more context for why I keep bringing him up because he's really important. And I took notes and I'm just going to tell you what I found. So he was born in 1935. He died in 2003. He was a Palestinian American. He he was a slacker. He went to Harvard. I didn't write down where he went to school. I think he did like undergrad at Princeton and grad school at Harvard, and then he worked at Columbia. So yeah, total slacker. But he was really coming up when the idea that there might be a way to look at world and civilization and culture through a viewpoint that isn't the one that you, I, all of us were raised with. No matter where you start out, that idea that, oh, different people have different ways of doing things that are just as valid and are kind of interesting. That was really just becoming a thing. So in 1978, he publishes this book, Orientalism, which pretty much wrote the groundwork for let's talk about a post-colonial world, shall we? It's interesting. I read it back in grad school. I don't remember a lot of details except just kind of going, oh my goodness, yes. So he's a professor of literature at Columbia, but he was also one of the founders of the post-colonial studies program at Columbia, importantly. And so the terms that he was attached to the most were Occidentalism, so the Occident being the West, and Orientalism being the East. He also frequently talked about the other, capital T, capital O. The idea of the other really started back with like Hegel, and John Stuart Mill went like gangbusters from that point. But he definitely picked up on the othering, which I know we have talked about on CraftLit before. When somebody is othered in society, that's never very good. We talked about it a lot with Oscar Wilde too. So in his discipline, he looked at the Western world as though it were a culture itself, and one that specifically saw other cultures as being static things, things that were one way, have always been that way, and aren't going to not be that way forever. And because of that, it makes it really easy to sideline those cultures and those people because we think ourselves, we don't even think overtly necessarily, but we will think we're the rational people. We're doing things the right way. We're flexible. We grow, we learn. And therefore, anybody who isn't us, and this could be any group of us, this could be teenagers, it doesn't matter. You look at the other group as being behind and how sad that is, how bad it is and everything. But with the Orientalism book, it was also this kind of exotification of the East, which I think a lot of people thought was praise. It's like these women are gorgeous and saris. Oh my goodness. And holy cow, there's so much art and so much literature, but it always had this kind of, as seen through a veil, exotic tint to it, which really, it doesn't, infantilization is the wrong word, but you know what I'm getting at? Like it makes them precious. So anybody who looks different from you, you might be saying as a compliment, you're so exotic, you're so alluring, but what you're really doing is just objectifying the entire culture and that while that may not be a horrible thing in your mind when it becomes a whole cultural kind of movement or stance, that makes it very easy to other people. And I'm going to give you one of his quotes that I thought was very good. And I'm going to give you a definition first. Epistemological. Epistemological relates to the theory of knowledge, especially regarding its methods, validity, not truth, validity. Is the argument valid, which means you have to have sound, valid starting points. Like your posture, the thing you posit has to be valid itself. So it's talking about knowledge, methods, validity, and scope. Sometimes it's easier to think of it as just the difference between understanding something because you have justifiable reasons to believe that versus opinions. The I believe, I think. So you will hear people occasionally, even on television, saying things like, well, what sort of epistemological basis is there for that claim? Because I have not seen anything that would validate that stance. So just keep epistemological in the back of your mind. This is the quote. To build a conceptual framework around a notion of us versus them is, in effect, to pretend that the principal consideration is epistemological and natural. So that's pretending that the most important thing you can say about you and any other group of people is the divide is natural and provable. That's the way things have been working. Our civilization is known and accepted. Theirs is different and strange. Whereas, in fact, the framework separating us from them, what it's actually doing, it is belligerent, it is constructed, and it is situational. And just this may not sound like news anymore, which is great. But you can imagine in 1978, well, this came out after he'd passed away, but woof. It changes people's approaches to literature, not in a bad way or it's not an identity politics kind of thing. It's like when I was at the Brooklyn Museum and I saw they had a little exhibit that came and went, but it was a sarcophagus that had an interior sarcophagus and nobody could figure out who this was, who it belonged to. And all of these male paleontologists and archaeologists and Egyptologists were saying, well, we can't figure out how this man wound up in this sarcophagus and guy. And it was always focused on it being a guy. And some women archaeologists walked in and they're like, well, that's the woman's paint. The paint that they have painted on here was a color that was used for women. So let's shift the paradigm and start talking about this like, ooh, maybe it was a woman and see if all the things make sense then. And it was like, oh, I guess it helps to have people with a different point of view, a different starting point in the room to have these conversations. It's certainly true in Melville. And I think it's important because Peter has been there, loved it, and has been very comfortable there for a very long time. Now that he's back, he's going to bring some of that with him. So I don't think it's accidental that Elizabeth Gaskell was using the term Oriental a lot. I don't think it's accidental that she had Signor Brunoni, and I don't think it's accidental that she has Peter coming back. She is always a problem writer. She always has some kind of societal situation that is irking her, and she wants to use her books to put forth a solution. This is no different. It's just lighter weight than North and South. There's still stuff going on all the time in her books. Then the next thing, I have never heard of this. If you have, please let me know. You can call 206-350-1642. You can email heather@craftlit.com. You can put comments in the comments. Negus, Negus. This is a hot drink. You combine, this is just one recipe, hot port, sugar, lemon, spices, kind of the spices you would expect, kind of Christmassy spices. Cook that up. That would be very strong. And so often they would water it down, which means you could really just drink this stuff all night. It would be a very soothing hot drink in the wintertime. It's also kind of like a hot toddy. It's got that medicinal thing because it's got the lemon, it's got the hot delivery device. The only thing it doesn't have is honey, but it's got sugar. The spices, you could put some really good spices in there that are medicinal as well. So I've given you a link to a Negus recipe. Actually, I think there's a couple on that page, but I wanted to let you know, apparently, one of the recipes that's out there is from Mrs. Beeton. Mrs. Beeton of the household management fame, and also the Mrs. Beeton who Brenda Dane based her little wristlets, the Beetons, on, and I've got a picture of that in the show notes because if you haven't seen those before, oh my goodness, they're gorgeous. And it's from Knitty, like in 2005. They're so beautiful, and I've made them and they are lovely. But Mrs. Beeton, in one of her editions of her book, had a recipe for this, including the alcohol, but I think she said, add it this way, add 1 part port and 2 parts water and then all these other things, and then serve it to the kids. They can drink it all night long. At a kid's birthday party. Here, go see the clown while you're drinking port. I mean, it's a 2-to-1 ratio. They're not going to get drunk, but it is just funny to come across that as kids drink for parties. Start with port. Okay, we can do that. There's a reference to the Preston Guild. We have come into contact with guilds a lot. This one's unique. Preston Guild was started. It came together as a guild in 1179. And ever since 1542, the Preston Guild has had a fair in Lancashire every 20 years. They've only skipped it one time, and that was in 1942. But aside from that, every 20 years since 1542, they have put on the Preston Guild Fair. There are videos online. It's adorable. It's lovely. It's wonderful. I put a map so that you can see what part of England, if you're not familiar with where Lancashire is. It's just above Liverpool on that side of the aisle, the sceptered aisle. But that's incredible. 1542. So the last one was in 2012. The next one's going to be in 2032. So if you want, make your plane travel tickets soon. You have some time. 2032. You've got, as fast as things go, you've still got some time. Don't forget that the word wonder, full, means that it is something that is full of wonder. Like it would be like an amazing tale. A wonderful tale might be more full of wonder than, wow, that's awesome. So just keep that. Propitiating. We don't come across that very often. It is winning or trying to regain favor. Sometimes in some stories, it's for like you're trying to do something to get a god to be working in your favor after maybe having lost their trust. Sometimes it's just a person, often a person who's socially a little bit above you. So propitiating that person is doing something that they would like and trying to get back in their good graces. Don't forget, we know this from the Brontes, dissenters, religious dissenters, people who were not members of the Church of England. We also know that from North and South. Dissenters for some people were worse than heathens. And I'm using heathens as kind of a term of art. People who didn't know Jesus were not to be blamed for that lack of knowledge nearly as much as people who had access to Church of England doctrine and teaching, but turned away from it. Those people were far more dangerous. I have always thought that was fascinating, but also kind of unsurprising, because the I'm going to have to find an expert on dissenters. If anybody knows somebody who really knows the religious history of England, specifically when the dissenters show up, I really need to talk to somebody because it is an interesting and complicated history. And then the last thing is just a heads up. Peter is going to do something in this chapter that might really tick you off. It certainly ticked me off while I was listening. It's like halfway through, and I'm like, what are you doing, you doofus? Let it go, because at the very end, he does something that I think mostly makes up for it. And of course, there's a very happy ending. All right, let's listen to the last chapter of Cranford. I'll catch you on the flip side to go over a couple things, and then we'll play you The Last Generation in England. 51 minutes, 26 seconds. Here we go.
Chapter 16 of Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. Recording by Noel Badrian. Peace to Cranford. It was not surprising that Mr. Peter became such a favourite at Cranford. The ladies vied with each other who should admire him most, and no wonder, for their quiet lives were astonishingly stirred up by the arrival from India, especially as the person arrived told more wonderful stories than Sinbad the Sailor, and, as Miss Pole said, was quite as good as an Arabian Night any evening. For my own part, I had vibrated all my life between Drumble and Cranford, and I thought it was quite possible that all Mr. Peter's stories might be true, although wonderful. But when I found that if we swallowed an anecdote of tolerable magnitude one week, we had the dose considerably increased the next, I began to have my doubts, especially as I noticed that when his sister was present, the accounts of Indian life were comparatively tame. Not that she knew more than we did, perhaps less. I noticed also that when the rector came to call, Mr. Peter talked in a different way about the countries he had been in. But I don't think the ladies in Cranford would have considered him such a wonderful traveller if they had only heard him talk in the quiet way he did to him. They liked him the better, indeed, for being what they called so very Oriental. One day, at a select party in his honour, which Miss Pole gave, and from which, as Mrs. Jameson honoured it with her presence, and had even offered to send Mr. Mulliner to wait, Mr. and Mrs. Hoggins and Mrs. Fitzadam were necessarily excluded. One day at Miss Pole's, Mr. Peter said he was tired of sitting upright against the hard-backed, uneasy chairs, and asked if he might not indulge himself in sitting cross-legged. Miss Pole's consent was eagerly given, and down he went with the utmost gravity. But when Miss Pole asked me, in an audible whisper, if he did not remind me of the Father of the Faithful, I could not help thinking of poor Simon Jones, the lame tailor, and while Mrs. Jameson slowly commented on the elegance and convenience of the attitude, I remembered how we had all followed that lady's lead in condemning Mr. Hoggins for vulgarity, because he simply crossed his legs as he sat still on his chair. Many of Mr. Peter's ways of eating were a little strange amongst such ladies as Miss Pole and Miss Matty and Mrs. Jameson, especially when I recollected the untasted green peas and two-pronged forks at poor Mr. Holbrook's dinner. The mention of that gentleman's name recalls to my mind a conversation between Mr. Peter and Miss Matty one evening in the summer after he had returned to Cranford. The day had been very hot, and Miss Matty had been much oppressed by the weather, in the heat of which her brother revelled. I remember that she had been unable to nurse Martha's baby, which had become her favourite employment of late, and which was as much at home in her arms as in its mother's, as long as it remained a light-weight, portable by one so fragile as Miss Matty. This day to which I refer, Miss Matty had seemed more than usually feeble and languid, and only revived when the sun went down and her sofa was wheeled to the open window, through which, although it looked into the principal street of Cranford, the fragrant smell of the neighbouring hayfields came in every now and then, borne by the soft breezes that stirred the dull air of the summer twilight, and then died away. The silence of the sultry atmosphere was lost in the murmuring noises which came in from many an open window and door. Even the children were abroad in the street, late as it was, between 10 and 11, enjoying the game of play, for which they had not had spirits during the heat of the day. It was a source of satisfaction to Miss Matty to see how few candles were lighted, even in the apartments of those houses from which issued the greatest signs of life. Mr. Peter, Miss Matty, and I had all been quiet, each with a separate reverie, for some little time, when Mr. Peter broke in. "Do you know, little Matty, I could have sworn you were on the high road to matrimony when I left England that last time. If anybody had told me you would have lived and died an old maid then, I should have laughed in their faces." Miss Matty made no reply, and I tried in vain to think of some subject which would effectually turn the conversation, but I was very stupid, and before I spoke he went on. "It was Holbrook, that fine manly fellow who lived at Woodley, that I used to think would carry off my little Matty. You would not think it now, I dare say, Mary, but this little sister of mine was once a very pretty girl. At least I thought so, and so I've a notion did poor Holbrook. What business had he to die before I came home to thank him for all his kindness to a good-for-nothing cub as I was? It was that made me first think he cared for you. For in all our fishing expeditions it was Matty we talked about. Poor Deborah, what a lecture she read me on having asked him home to lunch one day, when she had seen the Arley carriage in the town, and thought that my lady might call. Well, that's long years ago, more than half a lifetime, and yet it seems like yesterday. I don't know a fellow I should have liked better as a brother-in-law. You must have played your cards badly, my little Matty, somehow or another. Wanted your brother to be a good go-between, little one?" said he, putting out his hand to take hold of hers as she lay on the sofa. "Why, what's this? You're shivering and shaking, Matty, with that confounded open window. Shut it, Mary, this minute." I did so, and then stooped down to kiss Miss Matty and see if she really were chilled. She caught at my hand and gave it a hard squeeze, but unconsciously, I think, for in a minute or two she spoke to us quite in her usual voice, and smiled our uneasiness away, although she patiently submitted to the prescriptions we enforced of a warm bed and a glass of weak negus. I was to leave Cranford the next day, and before I went I saw that all the effects of the open window had quite vanished. I had superintended most of the alterations necessary in the house and household during the latter weeks of my stay. The shop was once more a parlour, the empty resounding rooms again furnished up to the very garrets. There had been some talk of establishing Martha and Jem in another house, but Miss Matty would not hear of this. Indeed, I never saw her so much roused as when Miss Pole had assumed it to be the most desirable arrangement. As long as Martha would remain with Miss Matty was only too thankful to have her about her. Yes, and Jem too, who was a very pleasant man to have in the house, for she never saw him from week's end to week's end. And as for the probable children, if they would all turn out such little darlings as her goddaughter Matilda, she should not mind the number if Martha didn't. Besides, the next was to be called Deborah, a point which Miss Matty had reluctantly yielded to Martha's stubborn determination that her firstborn was to be Matilda. So Miss Pole had to lower her colours, and even her voice, as she said to me that, as Mr. and Mrs. Hearn were still to go on living in the same house with Miss Matty, we had certainly done a wise thing in hiring Martha's niece as an auxiliary. I left Miss Matty and Mr. Peter most comfortable and contented, the only subject for regret to the tender heart of the one and the social friendly nature of the other being the unfortunate quarrel between Mrs. Jameson and the plebeian Hogginses and their following. In joke, I prophesied one day that this would only last until Mrs. Jameson or Mr. Mulliner were ill, in which case they would only be too glad to be friends with Mr. Hoggins. But Miss Matty did not like my looking forward to anything like illness in so light a manner, and before the year was out, all had come round in a far more satisfactory way. I received 2 Cranford letters on one auspicious October morning. Both Miss Pole and Miss Matty wrote to ask me to come over and meet the Gordons, who had returned to England alive and well, with their 2 children now almost grown up. Dear Jessie Brown had kept her old kind nature, although she had changed her name and station, and she wrote to say that she and Major Gordon expected to be in Cranford on the 14th, and she hoped and begged to be remembered to Mrs. Jameson, named first as became her honourable station, Miss Pole and Miss Matty. Could she ever forget their kindness to her poor father and sister? Mrs. Forrester, Mr. Hoggins, and here again came in an allusion to kindness shown to the dead long ago, his new wife, who as such must allow Mrs. Gordon to desire to make her acquaintance, and who was, moreover, an old Scotch friend of her husband's. In short, everyone was named, from the rector, who had been appointed to Cranford in the interim between Captain Brown's death and Miss Jessie's marriage, and was now associated with the latter event, down to Miss Betsy Barker. All were asked to the luncheon, all except Mrs. Fitzadam, who had come to live in Cranford since Miss Jessie Brown's days, and whom I found rather moping on account of the omission. People wondered at Miss Betty Barker's being included in the honourable list, but then, as Miss Pole said, we must remember the disregard of the genteel proprieties of life in which the poor captain had educated his girls, and for his sake we swallowed our pride. Indeed, Mrs. Jameson rather took it as a compliment, as putting Miss Betty, formerly her maid, on a level with those Hogginses. But when I arrived in Cranford, nothing was as yet ascertained of Mrs. Jameson's own intentions. Would the honourable lady go, or would she not? Mr. Peter declared that she should, and she would. Miss Pole shook her head and desponded. But Mr. Peter was a man of resources. In the first place, he persuaded Miss Matty to write to Mrs. Gordon, and to tell her of Mrs. Fitzadam's existence, and to beg that one so kind and cordial and generous might be included in the pleasant invitation. An answer came back by return of post with a pretty little note for Mrs. Fitzadam, and a request that Miss Matty would deliver it herself and explain the previous omission. Mrs. Fitzadam was as pleased as could be, and thanked Miss Matty over and over again. Mr. Peter had said, "Leave Mrs. Jameson to me," so we did, especially as we knew nothing that we could do to alter her determination if once formed. I did not know, nor did Miss Matty, how things were going on, until Miss Pole asked me, just the day before Mrs. Gordon came, if I thought there was anything between Mr. Peter and Mrs. Jameson in the matrimonial line, for that Mrs. Jameson was really going to the lunch at the George. She had sent Mr. Mulliner down to desire that there might be a footstool put to the warmest seat in the room, as she meant to come and knew that their chairs were very high. Miss Pole had picked this piece of news up, and from it she conjectured all sorts of things, and bemoaned yet more. If Peter should marry, what would become of poor dear Miss Matty? And Mrs. Jameson of all people! Miss Pole seemed to think there were other ladies in Cranford who would have done more credit to his choice, and I think she must have had some one who was unmarried in her head, for she kept saying it was so wanting in delicacy in a widow to think of such a thing. When I got back to Miss Matty's, I really did begin to think that Mr. Peter might be thinking of Mrs. Jameson for a wife, and I was as unhappy as Miss Pole about it. He had the proof-sheet of a great placard in his hand. Signor Brunoni, magician to the King of Delhi, the Rajah of Oud, and the great Lama of Thibet, etc., etc., was going to perform in Cranford for one night only, the very next night, and Miss Matty, exultant, showed me a letter from the Gordons, promising to remain over this gaiety, which Miss Matty said was entirely Peter's doing. He had written to ask the Signor to come, and was to be at all the expenses of the affair. Tickets were to be sent gratis to as many as the room would hold. In short, Miss Matty was charmed with the plan, and said that tomorrow Cranford would remind her of the Preston Guild, to which she had been in her youth. A luncheon at the George with the dear Gordons, and the Signor in the assembly room in the evening. But I looked only at the fatal words, under the patronage of the Honourable Mrs. Jameson. She, then, was chosen to preside over this entertainment of Mr. Peter's. She was, perhaps, going to displace my dear Miss Matty in his heart, and make her life lonely once more. I could not look forward to the morrow with any pleasure, and every innocent anticipation of Miss Matty's only served to add to my annoyance. So, angry and irritated, and exaggerating every little incident which could add to my irritation, I went on till we were all assembled in the great parlour at the George. Major and Mrs. Gordon, and pretty Flora, and Mr. Ludovic, were all as bright and handsome and friendly as could be, but I could hardly attend to them for watching Mr. Peter, and I saw that Miss Pole was equally busy. I had never seen Mrs. Jameson so roused and animated before. Her face looked full of interest in what Mr. Peter was saying. I drew near to listen. My relief was great when I caught that his words were not words of love, but that, for all his grave face, he was at his old tricks. He was telling her of his travels in India, and describing the wonderful height of the Himalaya mountains. One touch after another added to their size, and each exceeded the former in absurdity. But Mrs. Jameson really enjoyed all in perfect good faith. I suppose she required strong stimulants to excite her to come out of her apathy. Mr. Peter wound up his account by saying that, of course, at that altitude there were none of the animals to be found that existed in the lower regions. The game, everything was different. Firing one day at some flying creature, he was very much dismayed when it fell, to find that he had shot a cherubim. Mr. Peter caught my eye at this moment, and gave me such a funny twinkle that I felt sure he had no thoughts of Mrs. Jameson as a wife from that time. She looked uncomfortably amazed. "But, Mr. Peter, shooting a cherubim, don't you think? I'm afraid that was sacrilege." Mr. Peter composed his countenance in a moment, and appeared shocked at the idea, which, as he said, truly enough, was now presented to him for the first time. But then Mrs. Jameson must remember that he had been living for a long time among savages, all of whom were heathens. Some of them, he was afraid, were downright dissenters. Then, seeing Miss Matty draw near, he hastily changed the conversation, and after a little while, turning to me, he said, Don't be shocked, prim little Mary, at all my wonderful stories. I consider Mrs. Jameson fair game, and besides I am bent on propitiating her, and the first step towards it is keeping her well awake. I bribed her here by asking her to let me have her name as patroness for my poor conjurer this evening, and I don't want to give her time enough to get up her rancour against the Hogginses, who are just coming in. I want everybody to be friends, for it harasses Matty so much to hear of these quarrels. I shall go at it again by and by, so you need not look shocked. I intend to enter the assembly room to-night, with Mrs. Jameson on one side, and my lady, Mrs. Hoggins, on the other. You see if I don't." Somehow or another he did, and fairly got them into conversation together. Major and Mrs. Gordon helped at the good work with their perfect ignorance of any existing coolness between any of the inhabitants of Cranford. Ever since that day there has been the old friendly sociability in Cranford society, which I am thankful for, because of my dear Miss Matty's love of peace and kindliness. We all love Miss Matty, and I somehow think we are all of us better when she is near us. End of chapter 16, and end of Cranford, by Elizabeth Gaskell.
So, everybody's better when Miss Matty is around. I agree. That just made me happy. It was a happy end. And I thought the way that Elizabeth Gaskell talks about the women, like, allowing themselves to find a way to be okay with Peter sitting on the floor, another adult sitting on the floor, crisscross applesauce, crisscrossing his legs. I just loved how they're like, "W that doesn't look proper, but perhaps it's a good thing." And that's when the Father Abraham thing comes in. I don't know why Father Abraham would make you think about sitting oh, no, I guess I do. If you just see Father Abraham as part of Middle Eastern culture, you could very well come up with that. And that way of sitting is definitely in some tapestries that these women might have seen in their life, tapestries or paintings or book plates. I thought it was fascinating that Major Gordon apparently knows Mrs. Hoggins through this Lady Glenmire formerly, through her husband, her Scottish husband. Small world. I laughed out loud when I heard that the women had been kind of scandalized that Betty Barker had been invited to the luncheon, that Miss Jessie invited her to the luncheon, because Betty Barker had been Mrs. Jameson's maid. And Miss Pole's response is, well, the captain really didn't pay attention to the genteel proprieties of life, so maybe we can give this one a pass since it's Jessie who invited her. And then Mrs. Jameson's thrilled because the Hogginses, so former Lady Glenmire and Dr. Hoggins, they got invited too. And now, because her former maid has been invited as well, that puts the Hogginses / Lady Glenmire on the same social standing, so she can feel smug about that. I will say, Return to Cranford, that scene with all the Lady Glenmire stuff is in Return to Cranford. She's charming. That part's great. And the scene when Mrs. Jameson comes in and says, it's not that you're not going to come and visit her the first day, it's that you're not going to come and visit her at all. She's above you. The end. That scene is so tortured and uncomfortable. It is genius. I can't think of a time in my life as an American where I've ever seen somebody hold their ground like that on a social issue, and not with people who they care about and who they are going to have to live around for a long time. Yeah, wow. That scene was rough. It was very good. At first, I thought Peter had paid for Signor Brunoni, but no, he got Mrs. Jameson to do it. But he's a crafty bugger. He's telling these ridiculous stories, like shooting the cherubim, which cracked me up. And I saw interview. It was the Life of Robert Shaw that we were watching because we were thinking, we'd seen him in Jaws, we'd seen him in Man for All Seasons, but we knew he'd had a bigger career than that, so we found a biography on him. Evidently, during Jaws, there was a local fisherman who they hired to teach him how to speak. That is not his natural accent when he's Captain Quint, but he's an excellent actor, and so he truly like transplanted this guy's accent into his mouth. But he spent a lot of time with this guy, and this guy was telling him stories. And there is footage of Robert Shaw being interviewed about Martha's Vineyard saying, "Oh yes, horrible incest on the island. Oh yes, no, it's incredible." And it's just one of those stories that this guy had told him that's complete BS. His daughter, the guy who taught Robert Shaw how to do the actress, was still alive, and they were interviewing her, and she's like, "Everybody was cracking up when we saw that because we all knew where he got that from and that it wasn't true." Peter's kind of doing the same thing. And I love that he sees that Mary, see, and this is why he's an interesting guy. He notices that Mary is a little upset by the way he's treating Mrs. Jameson. And then for him to come back and say, "I bribed her here by asking her to let me have her be named as patron for the poor conjurer this evening. And I don't want to give her time enough to get her rancor up about the Hogginses who are just coming in. I want everybody to be friends, for it harasses Maddie so much to hear of these quarrels." And then warning her, "I'm going to go at it again by and by, so don't look shocked. I'm going to enter the assembly rooms with Mrs. Jameson on one arm and my lady, Mrs. Hoggins, on the other. See if I don't." And I thought, okay, that makes up for him being a bonehead about Mr. Holbrook, because he would have missed all the drama. Whatever it was that happened with the father and Deborah to get Miss Maddie off Mr. Holbrook's radar, he wasn't there for it. Peter didn't know any of it, which is tragic. And because I don't think it would have happened if Peter had been there. So when he was asking Maddie about Mr. Holbrook, it just hurt so much. This made me feel better because he's doing this for Maddie. He's found a way to bring calm and peace, still by doing his own thing. I mean, he is still very much himself, and he's pranking everybody. He has a great time doing it, but he's doing it now with the purpose of making sure that everybody is fine together so that Miss Maddie can have a good time. And I thought, that's pretty cool. That's a good way to end it. So there it is. There's Cranford. Quick reminder, don't forget, if you have a crafty video to send to us, please do. There's a link in the show notes. And next Thursday, the last Thursday of July 2025, we're watching The Princess Bride together. If you are one of the 7 people on the planet who have never seen this film, please join us. And if you are one of the millions who have memorized most of this film, also please join us. We'll see who can type inconceivable fastest the first time that Wally Shawn sees it. If we wanted to be really ridiculous, we could have a drinking game for every time Wally Shawn says inconceivable. I don't think we'd watch the rest of the movie though if we did that. So perhaps not. But either way, Princess Bride next week. And then the August book for the book party will be The Last Unicorn, which was a suggestion. It is not a book that I grew up reading. And it is, the book and movie pairing is an interesting one. So if you are somebody who read that book as a child, next month, August, will be a time for you to revisit that and have some fun with us. Yeah, I think that's everything. So The Last Generation in England was an essay that Elizabeth Gaskell wrote before she wrote Cranford. This was her kind of like on-ramp, revving up to do Cranford. And this was not published in a Charles Dickens publication. It was actually published in an American publication first, Sartain's Union Magazine of Literature and Art, in July 1849. So this Last Generation in England came out. And then in 1863, so way after she wrote Cranford, like 13 years after, she did publish something in All the Year Round. So not Household Words, but another Dickens publication. And it's called The Cage at Cranford. And these 2 documents have been put together and read for us by Noel Badrian. So it's kind of a seamless continuation. And as I said before, you're just going to hear where everybody came from in the Cranford story, which is just marvelous fun to get to see real life versus fiction fiction life. And one of the reasons why we're listening to this right now is I wanted to, as I said, put this up against the book itself so that you have kind of one full entertainment experience of all of this. But also because Noel Badrian, who's been reading the text for us, also reads these texts. He does them at the beginning of Mr. Harrison's Confessions. And we're starting with that because he reads it, number one, and he's an excellent reader. If you're not listening to him, you probably won't be able to get these essays unless you listen to them here. He's real good. I was actually going to start with My Lady Ludlow, but it's one of those group projects over on LibriVox, and there were some readers that I couldn't do that to you. There was a lot of mispronunciation, but when you say Leicester, and there were even words that were easier than that. One of the words was Volitian. It took me so long to figure out what she was saying. If really, when the reading actually makes it hard to understand the text, that's where I generally draw a line. We have had not great readers before from LibriVox, but yeah, when it starts to be, you're not going to understand. I mean, not everybody is BJ Harrison or Elizabeth Klett, I know, but we do have a CraftLit volunteer over on Discord. I put the call out. So Lily M over on Discord said that she would read it for us. So we're getting a CraftLit listener to do it. And I'm very, very happy because she has the appropriate voice and knows how to say Leicester Square. So I feel better. But thank you, Lily, for doing that. And yeah, so we're going to do My Lady Ludlow second. And that will pretty much take care of all of Cranford. I'm going to take a couple weeks in between just to make sure I've got all the ducks in the row. I'll stay with Moby Dick because I'm not taking a break from that. And then yeah, I'll be back with more Cranford for you so that we can continue living in this happy world for a little bit longer. All right. Enjoy the essay. I will talk to you soon. Take care. Have a great one. Bye.
Preface to Mr. Harrison's Confessions by Elizabeth Gaskell. The Last Generation in England by Elizabeth Gaskell. I have just taken up by chance an old number of the Edinburgh Review, April 1848, in which it is said that Southey had proposed to himself to write a History of English Domestic Life. I will not enlarge upon the infinite loss we have had in the non-fulfilment of this plan. Everyone must in some degree feel its extent who has read those charming glimpses of home scenes contained in the early volumes of The Doctor, etc. This quarter of an hour's chance reading has created a wish in me to put upon record some of the details of country town life either observed by myself or handed down to me by older relations. For even in small towns, scarcely removed from villages, the phases of society are rapidly changing, and much will appear strange which yet occurred only in the generation immediately preceding ours. I must, however, say, before going on, that although I choose to disguise my own identity, and to conceal the name of the town to which I refer, every circumstance and occurrence which I shall relate is strictly and truthfully told without exaggeration. As for classing the details with which I am acquainted under any heads, that will be impossible from their heterogeneous nature. I must write them down as they arise in my memory. The town in which I once resided is situated in a district inhabited by large landed proprietors of very old family. The daughters of these families, if unmarried, retired to live in X on their annuities, and gave the tone to the society there. Stately ladies they were, remembering etiquette and precedence in every occurrence of life, and having their genealogy at their tongue's end. Then there were the widows of the cadets of these same families, also poor and also proud, but I think more genial and less given to recounting their pedigrees than the former. Then came the professional men and their wives, who were more wealthy than the ladies I have named, but who always treated them with deference and respect, sometimes even amounting to obsequiousness. For was there not my brother Sir John A., and my uncle Mr. X of Y, to give employment and patronage to the doctor or the attorney? A grade lower came a class of single or widowed ladies, and again it was possible, not to say probable, that their pecuniary circumstances were in better condition than those of the aristocratic dames, who nevertheless refused to meet in general society, the ci devant housekeepers or widows of stewards who had been employed by their fathers and brothers. They would occasionally condescend to ask Mason, or that good Bentley, to a private tea-drinking, at which I doubt not much gossip relating to former days at the Hall would pass. But that was patronage. To associate with them at another person's house would have been an acknowledgment of equality. Below again came the shopkeepers, who dared to be original, who gave comfortable suppers after the very early dinners of that day, not checked by the Honourable Mr. D.'s precedent of a 7 o'clock tea on the most elegant and economical principles, and a supperless turn-out at 9. There were the usual respectable and disrespectable poor, and hanging on the outskirts of society were a set of young men ready for mischief and brutality, and every now and then dropping off the pit's brink into crime. The habits of this class, about 40 years ago, were much as those of the Mohawks a century before. They would stop ladies, returning from the card parties, which were the staple gaiety of the place, and who were only attended by a maidservant bearing a lantern, and whip them, literally whip them as you whip a little child, until, administering such chastisement to a good, precise old lady of high family, my brother the magistrate came forward and put down such proceedings with a high hand. Certainly there was more individuality of character in those days than now. No one, even in a little town of 2,000 inhabitants, would now be found to drive out with a carriage full of dogs, each dressed in the male or female fashion of the day, as the case might be, each dog provided with a pair of house shoes, for which his carriage boots were changed on his return. No old lady would be so oblivious of Mrs. Grundy's existence now as to dare to invest her favourite cow, after its unlucky fall into a lime-pit, in flannel waistcoat and drawers, in which the said cow paraded the streets of X to the day of its death. There were many regulations which were strictly attended to in the society of X, and which probably checked more manifestations of eccentricity. Before a certain hour in the morning, calls were never paid, nor yet after a certain hour in the afternoon. The consequence was that everybody was out calling on everybody at the same time, for it was de rigueur that morning calls should be returned within 3 days, and accordingly, making due allowance for our proportion of rain in England, every fine morning was given up to this employment. A quarter of an hour was the limit of a morning call. Before the appointed hour of reception, I fancy the employment of many of the ladies was fitting up their laces and muslins, which, for the information of all those whom it may concern, were never ironed, but carefully stretched and pinned thread by thread, with most Lilliputian pieces, on a board covered with flannel. Most of these scions of quality had many pounds' worth of valuable laces descended to them from mothers and grandmothers, which must be got up by no hands, as you may guess, but those of fairly fair. Indeed, when muslin and net were a guinea a yard, this was not to be wondered at. The lace was washed in buttermilk, which gave rise to an odd little circumstance. One lady left her lace basted up in some not very sour buttermilk, and unluckily the cat lapped it up, lace and all. One would have thought the lace would have choked her, but so it was. The lace was too valuable to be lost, so a small dose of tartar emetic was administered to the poor cat. The lace, returned to view, was carefully darned and decked the good lady's best cap for many a year after. And many a time did she tell the story, gracefully bridling up in a prim sort of way, and giving a little cough, as if preliminary to a rather improper story. The first sentence of it was always, I remember, "I do not think you can guess where the lace on my cap has been," dropping her voice, "in pussy's inside, my dear." The dinner hour was 3 o'clock in all houses of any pretensions to gentility, and a very late hour it was considered to be. Soon after 4, 1 or 2 inveterate card-players might be seen in calash and pattens, picking their way along the streets to the house where the party of the evening was to be held. As soon as they arrived and had unpacked themselves, an operation of a good half-hour's duration in the dining-parlour, they were ushered into the drawing-room, where, unless in the very height of summer, it was considered a delicate attention to have the shutters closed, the curtains drawn, and the candles lighted. The card-tables were set out, each with 2 new packs of cards, for which it was customary to pay, each person placing a shilling under one of the candlesticks. The ladies settled down to preference, and allowed of no interruption. Even the tea-trays were placed on the middle of the card-tables, and tea hastily gulped down with a few remarks on the good or ill fortune of the evening. New arrivals were greeted with nods in the intervals of the game, and as people entered the room they were pounced upon by the lady of the house to form another table. Cards were a business in those days, not a recreation. Their very names were to be treated with reverence. Someone came to X from a place where flippancy was in fashion. He called the knave Jack, and everybody looked grave and voted him vulgar. But when he was overheard calling preference, the decorous, highly respectable game of preference, why, what course remained for us but to cut him, and cut him we did. About 8:30, notices of servants having arrived for their respective mistresses were given. The games were concluded, accounts settled, a few parting squibs and cracks let off at careless or unlucky partners, and the party separated. By 10 o'clock all was in bed and asleep. I have made no mention of gentlemen at these parties, because if ever there was an Amazonian town in England, it was X. 11 widows of respectability at one time kept house there, besides spinsters innumerable. The doctor preferred his armchair and slippers to the forms of society, such as I have described, and so did the attorney, who was besides not insensible to the charms of a hot supper. Indeed, I suppose it was because of the small incomes of the more aristocratic portion of our little society, not sufficing both for style and luxury, but it was a fact that as gentility decreased, good living increased in proportion. We had the honour and glory of looking at old plate and delicate china at the comme il faut tea parties, but the slices of bread and butter were like wafers, and the sugar for coffee was rather of the brownest. Still, there was much gracious kindness among our haut volets. In those times, good Mr. Rigmarole, carriages were carriages, and there were not the infinite variety of brooms, droshkis, etc., etc., down to a wheelbarrow, which now make locomotion easy. Nor yet were there cars and cabs and flys ready for hire in our little town. A post-chaise was the only conveyance besides the sedan chair, of which more anon. So the widow of an earl's son, who possessed a proper old-fashioned coach and pair, would on rainy nights send her carriage, the only private carriage of X, round the town, picking up all the dowagers and invalids, and conveying them dry and safe to and from their evening engagement. The various other ladies who, in virtue of their relations holding manors and maintaining gamekeepers, had frequent presents, during the season, of partridges, pheasants, etc., etc., would daintily carve off the titbits, and putting them carefully into a hot basin, bid Betty or Molly cover it up quickly and carry it to Mrs. or Miss So-and-so, whose appetite was but weakly, and who required dainties to tempt it, which she could not afford to purchase. These poorer ladies had also their parties in turn. They were too proud to accept invitations if they might not return them, although various and amusing were their innocent makeshifts and imitations. To give you only one instance, I remember a card party at one of these good ladies' lodgings, where, when tea-time arrived, the ladies sitting on the sofa had to be displaced for a minute, in order that the tea-trays, plates of cake, bread and butter and all, might be extricated from their concealment under the valances of the couch. You may imagine the subjects of the conversation amongst these ladies: cards, servants, relations, pedigrees, and last and best, much mutual interest about the poor of the town, to whom they were one and all kind and indefatigable benefactresses. Cooking, sewing for, advising, doctoring, doing everything but educating them. One or two old ladies dwelt on the glories of former days, when X boasted of 2 earls' daughters as residents. Though it must be 60 years since they died, there are traces of their characters yet lingering about the place. Proud, precise, and generous, bitter Tories they were. Their sister had married a general, more distinguished for a successful comedy than for his mode of conducting the war in America, and, consequently, his sisters-in-law held the name of Washington in deep abhorrence. I can fancy the way in which they must have spoken of him, from the shudder of abomination with which their devoted admirers spoke years afterwards of "that man Washington." Lady Jane was moreover a benefactress to X. Before her day, the pavement of the footpaths was composed of loose round stones, placed so far apart that a delicate ankle might receive a severe wrench from slipping between. But she left a sum of money in her will to make and keep in repair a flag pavement, on condition that it should only be broad enough for one to walk abreast, in order to put a stop to the indecent custom coming into vogue of ladies linking with gentlemen, linking being the old-fashioned word for walking arm in arm. Lady Jane also left her sedan and money to pay the bearers for the use of the ladies of X, who were frequently like Adam and Eve in the weather-glass in consequence, the first arrival at a party having to commence the order of returning when the last lady was only just entering upon the gaieties of the evening. The old ladies were living hoards of family tradition and old custom. One of them, a Shropshire woman, had been to school in London about the middle of the last century. The journey from Shropshire took her a week. At the school to which she was sent, besides fine work of innumerable descriptions, pastry and the art of confectionery were taught to those whose parents desired it. The dancing master gave his pupils instruction in the art of using a fan properly. Although an only child, she had never sat down in her parents' presence without leave until she was married, and spoke with infinite disgust of the modern familiarity with which children treated their parents. "In my days," said she, "when we wrote to our fathers and mothers, we began, 'Honoured Sir,' or 'Honoured Madam,' None of your dear mammas or dear papas would have been permitted. And we ruled off our margin before beginning our letters, instead of cramming writing into every corner of the paper, and when we ended our letters, we asked our parents' blessing if we were writing to them, and if we wrote to a friend, we were content to remain your affectionate friend, instead of hunting up some newfangled expression such as your attached, your loving, etc. Fanny, my dear, I got a letter today signed, yours cordially, like a dram shop. What will this world come to? Then she would tell how a gentleman, having asked her to dance in her youth, never thought of such familiarity as offering her his arm to conduct her to her place, but taking up the flap of his silk-lined coat, he placed it over his open palm, and on it the lady daintily rested the tips of her fingers. To be sure, my dear old lady once confessed to a story neither so pretty nor so proper, namely, that one of the amusements of her youth was measuring noses with some gentleman, not an uncommon thing in those days, and, as lips lie below noses, such measurements frequently ended in kisses. At her house there was a little silver basket strainer, and once remarking on this, she showed me a silver saucer pierced through with holes, and told me it was a relic of the times when tea was first introduced into England. After it had been infused and the beverage drank, the leaves were taken out of the teapot and placed on this strainer, and then eaten by those who liked with sugar and butter, and very good they were, she added. Another relic which she possessed was an old receipt book, dating back to the middle of the 16th century. Our grandmothers must have been strong-headed women, for there were numerous receipts for ladies' beverages, etc., generally beginning with, "Take a gallon of brandy," or any other spirit. The puddings, too, were no light matters. One receipt, which I copied for the curiosity of the thing, begins with, "Take 30 eggs, 2 quarts of cream," etc. These Brobdingnagian puddings, she explained, by saying that the afternoon meal, before the introduction of tea, generally consisted of cakes and cold puddings, together with a glass of what we should now call liqueur, but which was then denominated bitters. The same old lady advocated strongly the manner in which marriages were formerly often brought about. A young man went up to London to study for the bar, to become a merchant, or what not, and arrived at middle age without having thought about matrimony, when, finding himself rich and desirous of being married, he would frequently write to some college friend, or to the clergyman of his native place, asking him to recommend a wife, whereupon the friend would send a list of suitable ladies. The bachelor would make his selection, and empower his friend to wait upon the parents of the chosen one, who accepted or refused without much consultation of their daughter's wishes. Often the first intelligence she had of the affair was by being told by her mother to adorn herself in her best, as the gentleman her parents proposed for her husband was expected by the night coach to supper. And very happy marriages they turned out, my dear, very, my venerable informant would add, sighing. I always suspected that her own had been of this description. End of The Last Generation in England, by Elizabeth Gaskell.
Hey, this is Heather from the future interrupting. So, Noel Badrian does not read the Cage story, the one that was written several years after Cranford itself was written. However, Lily M., who is reading Our Lady Ludlow for us, was fantastic and came through in a clutch recording this for us. And if you have seen Return to Cranford, Cranford Part 2, you will recognize this story. I was wondering where it came from, and here it is. So, huge thanks to Lily M. Let's listen to The Cage at Cranford.
The Cage at Cranford, 1863. Have I told you anything about my friends at Cranford since the year 1856? I think not. You remember the Gordons, don't you? She that was Jessie Brown, who married her old love, Major Gordon, and from being poor became quite a rich lady, but for all that never forgot any of her old friends in Cranford. Well, the Gordons were travelling abroad, for they were very fond of travelling. People who have had to spend part of their lives in a regiment always are, I think. They were now in Paris in May 1856, and were going to stop there and in the neighbourhood all summer, but Mr. Ludovich was coming to England soon, so Mrs. Gordon wrote me word. I was glad she told me, for just then I was waiting to make a little present to Miss Pole, with whom I was staying, so I wrote to Mrs. Gordon and asked her to choose me out something pretty and new and fashionable that would be acceptable to Miss Pole. Miss Pole had just been talking a great deal about Mrs. Fitzadam's caps being so unfashionable, which I suppose made me put in that word, fashionable, but afterwards I wished I had sent to say my present was not to be too fashionable, for there is such a thing, I can assure you. The price of my present was not to be more than 20 shillings, but that is a very handsome sum if you put it in that way, though it may not sound so much if you only call it a sovereign. Mrs. Gordon wrote back to me, pleased as she always was with doing anything for her old friends. She told me she had been out for a day's shopping before going into the country, and had got a cage for herself of the newest and most elegant description, and had thought that she could not do better than get another like it as my present for Miss Pole, as cages were so much better made in Paris than anywhere else. I was rather dismayed when I read this letter, for however pretty a cage might be, it was something for Miss Pole's own self, and not for her parrot, that I had intended to get. Here had I been, finding ever so many reasons against her buying a new cap at Johnson's fashion show, because I thought that the present which Mrs. Gordon was to choose for me in Paris might turn out to be an elegant and fashionable headdress, a kind of cross between a turban and a cap, as I see those from Paris mostly are. And now I had to veer round and advise her to go as fast as she could and secure Mr. Johnson's cap before any other purchaser matched it up. But Miss Pole was too sharp for me. Why, Mary, said she, it was only yesterday you were running down that cap like anything. You said, you know, that lilac was too old a colour for me, and green too young, and that the mixture was very unbecoming. Yes, I know, said I, but I have thought better of it. I thought about it a great deal last night, and I thought, they would neutralise each other, and the shadows of any colour are, you know, something I know, complementary colours. I was not sure of my own meaning, but I had an idea in my head, though I could not express it. She took me up shortly. Child, you don't know what you are saying, and besides, I don't want compliments at my time of life. I lay awake too, thinking of the cap. I only buy one ready-made once a year, and of course it's a matter for consideration, and I came to the conclusion that you were quite right. Oh, dear Miss Pole, I was quite wrong. If you only knew, I did think it a very pretty cap, only, well, do just finish what you've got to say. You're almost as bad as Miss Matty in your way of talking, without being half as good as she is in other ways. Though I'm very fond of you, Mary, I don't mean I'm not, but you must see you're very off and on and very muddle-headed. It's the truth, so you will not mind my saying so. It was just because it did seem like the truth at that time that I did mind her saying so, and in despair I thought I would tell her all. I did not mean what I said. I don't think lilac too old or green too young, and I think the mixture very becoming to you, and I think you will never get such a pretty cap again, at least in Cranford. It was fully out, so far at least. Then, Mary Smith, will you tell me what you did mean by speaking as you did, and convincing me against my will, and giving me a bad night? I meant, Oh, Miss Pole, I meant to surprise you with a present from Paris, and I thought it would be a cap. Mrs. Gordon was to choose it, and Mr. Ludovic to bring it. I dare say it is in England now, only it's not a cap, and I did not want you to buy Johnson's cap when I thought I was getting another for you. Miss Pole found this speech muddle-headed, I have no doubt, though she did not say so, only making an odd noise of perplexity. I went on. I wrote to Mrs. Gordon and asked her to get you a present, something new and pretty. I meant it to be a dress, but I suppose I did not say so. I thought it would be a cap, for Paris is so famous for caps, and it is— You're a good girl, Mary. I was past 30, but did not object to being called a girl, and indeed I generally felt like a girl at Cranford, where everybody was so much older than I was. But when you want a thing, say what you want. It is the best way in general. And now I suppose Mrs. Gordon has bought something quite different. A pair of shoes, I dare say, for people talk a deal of Paris shoes. Anyhow, I'm just as much obliged to you, Mary, my dear, only you should not go and spend your money on me. It was not much money, and it was not a pair of shoes. You'll let me go and get the cap, won't you? It was so pretty, somebody will be sure to snatch it up. I don't like getting a cap that's sure to be unbecoming. But it is not. It was not. I never saw you look so well in anything, said I. Mary, Mary, remember who is the father of lies. But he's not my father, exclaimed I, in a hurry, for I saw Mrs. Fitzadam go down the street in the direction of Johnson's shop. I'll eat my words, they were all false, only just let me run down and buy you that cap, that pretty cap. Well, run off, child. I liked it myself till you put me out of taste with it. I brought it back in triumph from under Mrs. Fitzadam's very nose as she was hanging in meditation over it, and the more we saw of it, the more we felt pleased with our purchase. We turned it on this side and we turned it on that, and though we hurried it away into Miss Pole's bedroom at the sound of a double knock at the door, when we found it was only Miss Matty and Mr. Peter, Miss Pole could not resist the opportunity of displaying it, and said in a solemn way to Miss Matty, Can I speak to you for a few minutes in private? And I knew feminine delicacy too well to explain what this grave prelude was to lead to, aware how immediately Miss Matty's anxious tremor would be allayed by the sight of the cap. I had to go on talking to Mr. Peter, however, when I would far rather have been in the bedroom and heard the observations and comments. We talked of the new cap all day, what gowns it would suit, whether a certain bow was not rather too coquettish for a woman of Miss Pole's age, no longer young, as she called herself, after a little struggle with the words, though at 65 she need not have blushed as if she were telling a falsehood. But at last the cap was put away, and with a wrench we turned our thoughts from the subject. We had been silent for a little while, each at our work with a candle between us, when Miss Pole began, It was very kind of you, Mary, to think of giving me a present from Paris. Oh, I was only too glad to be able to get you something. I hope you will like it, though it is not what I expected. I'm sure I shall like it, and a surprise is always so pleasant. Yes, but I think Mrs. Gordon has made a very odd choice. I wonder what it is. I don't like to ask, but there's a great deal in anticipation. I remember hearing dear Miss Jenkins say that anticipation was the soul of enjoyment, or something like that. Now, there is no anticipation in a surprise. That's the worst of it. Shall I tell you what it is? Just as you like, my dear. If it is any pleasure to you, I am quite willing to hear. Perhaps I had better not. It is something quite different to what I expected and meant to have got, and I'm not sure if I like it as well. Relieve your mind if you like, Mary. In all disappointments, sympathy is a great balm. Well, then, it's not something for you, it's for Polly. It's a cage. Mrs. Gordon says they make such pretty ones in Paris. I could see that Miss Pole's first emotion was disappointment, but she was very fond of her cockatoo, and the thought of his smartness in his new habitation made her be reconciled in a moment. besides that she was really grateful to me for having planned a present for her. Polly? Well, yes. His old cage is very shabby. He is so continually pecking at it with his sharp bill. I dare say Mrs. Gordon noticed it when she called here last October. I shall always think of you, Mary, when I see him in it. Now we can have him in the drawing-room, for I dare say a French cage will be quite an ornament to the room. And so she talked on, till we worked ourselves up into high delight at the idea of Polly in his new abode, presentable in it even to the Honourable Mrs. Jameson. The next morning Miss Pole said she had been dreaming of Polly with her new cap on his head, while she herself sat on a perch in the new cage and admired him. Then, as if ashamed of having revealed the fact of imagining such arrant nonsense in her sleep, she passed on rapidly to the philosophy of dreams, quoting some book she had lately been reading, which was either too deep in itself or too confused in her repetition for me to understand it. After breakfast, we had the cap out again, and that in its different aspects occupied us for an hour or so. And then, as it was a fine day, we turned into the garden, where Polly was hung on a nail outside the kitchen window. He clamoured and screamed at the sight of his mistress, who went to look for an almond for him. I examined his cage meanwhile, old discoloured wickerwork, clumsily made by a Cranford basket-maker. I took out Mrs. Gordon's letter. It was dated the 15th, and this was the 20th. I'd kept it secret for 2 days in my pocket. Mr. Ludovic was on the point of setting out for England when she wrote. "Poor Polly," said I, as Miss Pole, returning, fed him with the almond. "Ah, Polly does not know what a pretty cage he is going to have," said she, talking to him as she would have done to a child, and then, turning to me, she asked when I thought it would come. We reckoned up dates, and made out that it might arrive that very day. So she called to her little stupid servant maiden Fanny, and bade her go out and buy a great brass-headed nail, very strong enough to bear Polly and the new cage, and we all three weighed the cage in our hands, and on her return she was to come up into the drawing-room with the nail and a hammer. Fanny was a long time, as she always was, over her errands, but as soon as she came back we knocked the nail, with solemn earnestness, into the house wall, just outside the drawing-room window, for, as Miss Pole observed, when I was not there she had no one to talk to, and as in summer-time she generally sat with the window open, she could combine 2 purposes, the giving air and sun to Polly Cockatoo, and the having his agreeable companionship in her solitary hours. "When it rains, my dear, or even in a very hot sun, I shall take the cage in. I would not have your pretty presents spoilt for the world. It was very kind of you to think of it. I am quite come round to liking it better than any present of mere dress, and dear Mrs. Gordon has shown all her usual pretty observation in remembering my Polly Cockatoo." Polly Cockatoo was his grand name. I had only once or twice heard him spoken of by Miss Pole in this formal manner, except when she was speaking to the servants. Then she always gave him his full designation, just as most people call their daughters Miss in speaking of them to strangers or servants. But since Polly was to have a new cage, and all the way from Paris too, Miss Pole evidently thought it necessary to treat him with unusual respect. We were obliged to go out to pay some calls, but we left strict orders with Fanny what to do if the cage arrived in our absence, as, we had calculated, it might. Miss Pole stood ready bonneted and shawled at the kitchen door, I behind her, and cook behind Fanny, each of us listening to the conversation of the other 2. "And Fanny, mind if it comes you coax Polly Cockatoo nicely into it. He is very particular, and may be attached to his old cage, though it is so shabby. Remember, birds have their feelings as much as we have. Don't hurry him in making up his mind." "Please, ma'am, I think an almond would help him to get over his feelings," said Fanny, dropping a curtsy at every speech, as she had been taught to do at her charity school. "A very good idea, very. If I have my keys in my pocket, I will give you an almond for him. I think he is sure to like the view up the street from the window. He likes seeing people, I think. It's but a dull lookout into the garden, nowt but dumb flowers, said cook, touched by this allusion to the cheerfulness of the street, as contrasted with the view from her own kitchen window. It's a very good lookout for busy people, said Miss Pole, severely, and then, feeling she was likely to get the worst of it in an encounter with her old servant, she withdrew with meek dignity, being deaf to some sharp reply, and of course I, being bound to keep order, was deaf too. If the truth must be told, we rather hastened our steps until we had banged the street door behind us. We called on Miss Matty, of course, and then on Mrs. Hoggins. It seemed as if ill luck would have it that we went to the only two households of Cranford where there was the encumbrance of a man, and in both places the man was where he ought not to have been, namely in his own house and in the way. Miss Pole, out of civility to me, and because she really was full of the new cage for Polly, and because we all in Cranford relied on the sympathy of our neighbours in the veriest trifle that interested us, told Miss Matty and Mr. Peter and Mr. and Mrs. Hoggins he was standing in the drawing-room, booted and spurred, and eating his hunk of bread and cheese in the very presence of his aristocratic wife, my lady that was. As Miss Pole said afterwards, if refinement was not to be found in Cranford, blessed as it was with so many scions of county families, she did not know where to meet with it. Bread and cheese in a drawing-room, onions next. But, for all Mr. Hoggins's vulgarity, Miss Pole told him of the present she was about to receive. Only think I a new cage for Polly. Polly Cockatoo, you know Mr. Hoggins. You remember him, and the bite he gave me once because he wanted to be put back in his cage. Pretty bird. I only hope the new cage will be strong as well as pretty, for I must say he caught a look from his wife, I think, for he stopped short. Well, we're old friends, Polly and I, and he put some practice in my way once. I shall be up the street this afternoon, and perhaps I shall step in and see this smart Parisian cage. Do, said Miss Pole, eagerly, or, if you are in a hurry, look up at my drawing-room window. If the cage is come, it will be hanging out there, and Polly in it. We had passed the omnibus that met the train from London some time ago, so we were not surprised as we returned home to see Fanny half out of the window, and cook evidently either helping or hindering her. Then they both took their heads in, but there was no cage hanging up. We hastened up the steps. Both Fanny and the cook met us in the passage. Please, ma'am, said Fanny, there's no bottom to the cage, and Polly would fly away. And there's no top, exclaimed cook. He might get out at the top quite easy. Let me see, said Miss Pole, brushing past, thinking no doubt that her superior intelligence was all that was needed to set things right. On the ground lay a bundle, or a circle of hoops, neatly covered over with calico, no more like a cage for Polly Cockatoo than I am like a cage. Cook took something up between her finger and thumb and lifted the unsightly present from Paris. How I wish it had stayed there, but foolish ambition has brought people to ruin before now, and my 20 shillings are gone, sure enough, and there must be some use or some ornament intended by the maker of the thing before us. Don't you think it's a mouse trap, ma'am? Asked Fanny, dropping her little curtsy. For reply, the cook lifted up the machine and showed how easily mice might run out, and Fanny shrank back, abashed. Cook was evidently set against the new invention, and muttered about its being all of a piece with French things, French cooks, French plums, nasty dried-up things, French rolls, as had no substance in 'em. Miss Pole's good manners, and desire of making the best of things in my presence, induced her to try and drown Cook's mutterings. Indeed, I think it will make a very nice cage for Polly Cockatoo. How pleased he will be to go from one hoop to another, and just like a ladder, and with a board or two at the bottom, and nicely tied up at the top. Fanny was struck with the new idea. Please, ma'am, my sister-in-law has got an aunt as lives lady's maid with Sir John's daughter, Miss Arley, and they did say as she wore iron petticoats all made of hoops. Nonsense, Fanny, we all cried, for such a thing had not been heard of in all Drumble, let alone Cranford, and I was rather looked upon in the light of a fast young woman by all the laundresses of Cranford, because I had 2 corded petticoats. Go mind the business, wench, said cook, with the utmost contempt. I'll warrant we'll manage the cage without thy help. It is near dinner time, Fanny, and the cloth not laid, said Miss Pole, hoping the remark might cut 2 ways, but the cook had no notion of going. She stood on the bottom step of the stairs, holding the Paris perplexity aloft in the air. It might do for a meat safe, said she. Cover it o'er with canvas to keep the flies out. It is a good framework, I reckon, anyhow. She held her head on one side, like a connoisseur in meat safes, as she was. And Miss Pole said, Are you sure Mrs. Gordon called it a cage, Mary? Because she is a woman of her word, and would not have called it so if it was not. Look here, I have the letter in my pocket. I have wondered how I could best fulfil your commission for me to purchase something to the value of fashionable and pretty for dear Miss Pole, and at length I have decided upon one of the new kind of cages. Look here, Miss Pole, here is the word, C-A-G-E, which are made so much lighter and more elegant in Paris than in England. Indeed, I am not sure if they have ever reached you, for it is not a month since I saw the first of the kind in Paris. Does she say anything about Polly Cockatoo? Asked Miss Pole. That would settle the matter at once, as showing that she had him in her mind. No, nothing. Just then Fanny came along the passage with the tray full of dinner things in her hands. When she had put them down, she stood at the door of the dining room, taking a distant view of the article. Please, ma'am, it looks like a petticoat without any stuff in it. Indeed it does, if I'm to be whipped for saying it. But she only drew down upon herself a fresh objurgation from the cook, and, sorry and annoyed, I seized the opportunity of taking the thing out of cook's hand and carrying it upstairs, for it was full time to get ready for dinner. But we had very little appetite for our meal, and kept constantly making suggestions, one to the other, as to the nature and purpose of this Paris cage, but as constantly snubbing poor little Fanny's reiteration of, Please, ma'am, I do believe it's a kind of petticoat. Indeed I do. At length Miss Pole turned upon her with almost as much vehemence as cook had done, only in choicer language. Don't be so silly, Fanny. Do you think ladies are like children, and must be put in go-karts, or need wire guards like fires to surround them, or can get warmth out of bits of whalebone and steel? A likely thing indeed. Don't keep talking about what you don't understand. So our maiden was mute for the rest of the meal. After dinner, we had Polly brought upstairs in her old cage, and I held out the new one, and we turned it about in every way. At length Miss Pole said, Put Polly Cockatoo back, and shut him up in this cage. You hold this French thing up, alas I that my present should be called a thing, and I'll sew a bottom onto it. I'll lay a good deal they've forgotten to sew in the bottom before sending it off. So I held, and she sewed, and then she held and I sewed, till it was all done. Just as we had Polly Cockatoo in, and we were closing up the top with a pretty piece of old yellow ribbon, and indeed it was not a bad-looking cage, after all our trouble, Mr. Hoggins came upstairs, having been seen by Fanny before he had time to knock at the door. Hello, said he, almost tumbling over us, as we were sitting on the floor at our work. What's this? It's this pretty present for Polly Cockatoo, said Miss Pole, raising herself up with as much dignity as she could, that Mary has had sent from Paris for me. Miss Pole was in great spirits now we had got Polly in. I can't say that I was. Mr. Hoggins began to laugh in his boisterous, vulgar way. For Polly? Ha! It's meant for you, Miss Pole. Ha! It's a new invention to hold your gowns out. Ha! Mr. Hoggins, you may be a surgeon, and a very clever one, but nothing, not even your profession, gives you a right to be indecent. Miss Pole was thoroughly roused, and I trembled in my shoes. But Mr. Hoggins only laughed the more. Polly screamed in concert, but Miss Pole stood in stiff, rigid propriety, very red in the face. I beg your pardon, Miss Pole, I am sure, but I am pretty certain I am right. It's no indecency that I can see. My wife and Mrs. Fitzadam taking a Paris fashion book between 'em, and I can't help seeing the plates of fashions sometimes. Ha ha ha! Look, Polly has got out of his queer prison. Ha ha ha! Just then, Mr. Peter came in. Miss Matty was so curious to know if the expected present had arrived. Mr. Hoggins took them by the arm and pointed to the poor thing lying on the ground, but could not explain for laughing. Miss Pole said, Although I am not accustomed to give an explanation of my conduct to a gentleman, yet, being insulted in my own house by Mr. Hoggins, I must appeal to the brother of my old friend, my very oldest friend. Is this article a lady's petticoat or a bird's cage? She held it up as she made this solemn inquiry. Mr. Hoggins seized the moment to leave the room, in shame, as I supposed, but in reality to fetch his wife's fashion book, and, before I had completed the narration of the story of my unlucky commission, he returned, and, holding the fashion plate open by the side of the extended article, demonstrated the identity of the two. But Mr. Peter had always a smooth way of turning off anger, by either his fun or a compliment. It is a cage, said he, bowing to Miss Pole, but it is a cage for an angel instead of a bird. Come along, Hoggins, I want to speak to you. And with an apology, he took the offending and victorious surgeon out of Miss Pole's presence. For a good while we said nothing, and we were now rather shy of little Fanny's superior wisdom when she brought up tea. But towards night our spirits revived, and we were quite ourselves again, when Miss Pole proposed that we should cut up the pieces of steel or whalebone, which, to do them justice, were very elastic, and to make ourselves two very comfortable English calashes out of them, with the aid of a piece of dyed silk which Miss Pole had by her. The end.
You can find show notes for this episode and links to other episodes at craftlit.com. CraftLit also appears anywhere you can get a podcast: iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and on, including its own dedicated app. There are lots of ways to support CraftLit, from patreon.com/craftlit to craftlit.com memberships and channel memberships on YouTube. You can find out more details at craftlit.com/premium. And as always, thank you for your support. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.